Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for WRI webinar, Digging into Land Sector GHG Accounting under the Paris Agreement. Hope you're all doing well. Gonna give it one more minute, see if anyone else joins us. We're losing people
already.
All right, well, thanks again for joining us. We're here today to talk about Land Sector GHG Accounting, major issues and challenges that we're facing in with respect to greenhouse gas emissions accounting in agriculture, forestry, land management. We'll be giving you a brief overview of accounting rules under the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. And we'll be talking and looking into the future about how this sector will be accounted for under the Paris Agreement. You'll be, all participants are all of the attendees will be in listen-only mode. And you'll be able to answer questions or ask questions through the Q&A chat box, which is either usually at the bottom of your screen. It could also look at the top of the screen if you don't see it there. So you should feel free to ask any questions at any time using the Q&A box. There's also a chat box where you can reach out to us, but with any kind of technical issues, but please ask all your questions through the Q&A box. This webinar is hosted by WRI's Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action Initiative project, working in 5 countries, Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, to strengthen systems for tracking and reporting greenhouse gases. It's also hosted by the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, which is also another convener on GHG transparency and tracking issues. Today's panelists, I'll start by introducing Nancy Harris, who's here at WRI. She's the research manager for Global Forest Watch. Nancy, why don't you introduce the other guests?
Yeah, so I'm here with a group of 3 very distinguished speakers that we have lined up, all who have very deep expertise in the land sector issues around it, and they've all been in this space for a very long time. Our first speaker is Giacomo Grassi. He's a senior scientific officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, where he leads the group on land use change, and forestry, or LULUCF for short, within the Directorate on Sustainable Resources. Giacomo coordinates the LULUCF sector of annual greenhouse gas inventory for the European Union, and he also provides scientific support for EU policy design. Beyond the EU, Giacomo is an expert reviewer for the UNFCCC of GHG inventories submitted by other countries, and is a lead author of several IPCC reports, including the KP Supplement, the 2019 refinement to the 2006 reporting guidelines, and the recently released IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Today, Giacomo will talk about bridging gaps between science and policy that exist in the LULUCF sector. After Giacomo, we will have Jason Funk, who has conducted science and policy work at the intersection of land use and climate change for over 20 years, including over a decade of engagement in the UNFCCC. At the beginning of this year, Jason launched the Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative, which aims to cultivate more informed, cooperative, and charitable decision-making about the future of land use resources as they relate to our changing climate. Jason currently advises WRI and several other nonprofit advocacy groups about their climate and land use strategies. Jason today will give a very brief history of land use and accounting issues under the UNFCCC. And then finally, we have Peter Iverson, who is leading the team at the UNFCCC Secretariat working on land use issues, including forestry and agriculture. Peter has previously represented the Danish government at UNFCCC negotiation sessions, where he also co-chaired the LULUCF negotiations under the Kyoto Protocol, as well as agriculture discussions under the convention. Peter's also worked for the UN RED program in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Mongolia, and co-authored a very useful report for land use newbies called Understanding Land Use in the UNFCCC. And today, Peter will talk a little bit about what's next under the negotiations for the land sector. Okay, so first we have Giacomo, and I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning to everybody. Can you listen to me correctly? Can you listen to me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep, we're good.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody, and thanks for inviting me. Given the complexity of the topic introduced by Nancy before, I decided to follow the advice of my daughter, who once told me, "Daddy, your slides are a bit too complex. Why don't you tell a story instead?" Next slide. Next, yeah, thanks. And the story starts with two men flying in a balloon. These two men got lost over a forest. They saw two persons below them and asked for help. The person below tried to help them, explaining where they are. But the answer is that you must be a scientist. I asked you a simple question. You gave me too much information and I'm still lost. And the answer by scientists is you must be policymakers. I gave you an accurate answer, but you don't understand. If I tell you this story, it's because in my experience, many gaps in communication exist between science and policy when talking on forest and climate. Next. This is how science sees the global carbon cycle. On the left side, you have emissions mainly from fossil fuel, but also from land use changes, therefore deforestation. On the right side are where this emission goes. Nearly half remains in the atmosphere, creating global warming. The rest is absorbed by ocean and forest. Next. And this is how the greenhouse gas inventories, which are the basis for climate policies, capture these fluxes. On the left side, you have energy and transport with fossil fuel emissions, and then you have the so-called land use change, and forestry sector, the so-called LULUCF sector, which comprises land use emission from deforestation, from land use changes, and part of the CO2 absorption called sink by existing forest. Here it's important to understand that the forest sink is complex to measure and only partly anthropogenic. So while for energy and transport sector, all emissions are anthropogenic, so every decrease in emission can be claimed as mitigation. For forestry is much more complex. Forestry is part of a natural carbon cycle and it's very difficult to define what is mitigation. Next one. Till recently, for that reason, the complexity of LULUCF sector meant that it has often been seen as a secondary mitigation option by climate policy, a little bit like the ugly duckling that could be left behind by other greenhouse gas sector on the way toward Paris. Next one. Luckily, it didn't occur. I mean, the Paris Agreement has been a game changer for forest mitigation. First of all, according to the country pledges made in Paris, LULUCF is expected to provide about a quarter of planned global emission reduction by 2030 through reduced deforestation, but also through action to conserve and increase the current CO2 sinks. And then the Paris Agreement recognized explicitly that to keep the increasing temperature well below 2 degrees, we need to reach a balance between emissions and removals in the second half of the century, as you can see from the figure. And politicians realized that forests are currently the most important sink that humans can manage. Next one. On the other hand, science started to suggest that the potential for land mitigation is really important. There's been a paper by Griscom a couple of years ago where he identified a number of potential mitigation action in forestry and other land uses. More recently, in July, a paper on Science identified the global tree restoration potential with a very big number for that. Next. I show a double-edged sword here because I think that these kind of studies, especially the latter one on Science, are at the same time useful but also a bit risky. On the one hand, they help raising attention to a potential mitigation which is still largely ignored by climate finance, and this is very good. On the other hand, the risk is that people, maybe non-expert, read the message like forest will save us from the climate change problem, so don't panic too much on reducing fossil fuels. Next. So what is still missing to turn this mitigation potential into reality? And next slide, I will identify a few of the challenges. Next. The first one is, can we trust country-level estimates, greenhouse gas estimates? Can we trust what country report to the UN? And for example, how these estimates compare globally with scientific estimates. In the graph, you see over time the evolution of estimates from countries, which are indicated in green, with scientific independent estimates indicated with blue. You can see that there is a gap of about 4 to 5 gigatons of CO2 between scientific estimates, which indicate a much larger emission than countries' estimates, which indicate an emission close to zero. So essentially, what is emitted is compensated by what is absorbed by forest. Next. The short answer of this gap is because we are comparing different things. Despite countries' inventories and scientific estimates in theory should measure the same thing, in practice they are not. Next. This is because these different communities behind the country's greenhouse gas inventories and the community behind the IPCC assessment report develop different approaches to assess what is the anthropogenic forest sink. The greenhouse gas inventories include more area considered managed and include also the impact of environmental change, like the impact of CO2 fertilization as an anthropogenic flux. On the other hand, the scientific community consider this as part of the natural sink. Essentially, for tracking country progress toward the Paris target, this difference needs to be reconciled. And this has to be done before the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement that will happen in 2023. The global stocktake will essentially assess the country effort toward the Paris Agreement target in the light of the 2-degree projection made by the scientific community. Next. Another challenge is ensuring a credible accounting of forest mitigation action. The Paris Agreement calls for economy-wide climate targets, which include the land sector and specifically forestry. But fungibility across sector, which is implicit in these economy-wide targets, requires comparability. So comparing apple to apple, 1 ton of mitigation in the forest sector should be conceptually comparable with 1 ton of mitigation in the energy sector. This is far from easy, because the accounting of emission toward the climate target should reflect real deviation from past activity. And this is challenging for forestry due to the impact of age-related dynamics. Next. During the Kyoto Protocol, to address this specific feature of the forest sector, the projected reference level concept has been developed. Essentially, each country makes a projection of business as usual management, and the future performance will be measured against these business as usual projections, so that only what is beyond the expected sink can be counted and accounted toward the target. In Europe, we just finalized the legislation of that, and if interested, I may share more information. Next. Another challenge is that moving beyond the mitigation maximum and very theoretical sometimes potential, and try to identify barriers, synergies, and trade-off to address multiple challenges. Recently, the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land has been approved last August. And this report identified many low and medium cost-effective strategies based on sustainable land management available to address climate change mitigation and adaptation at the same time, but also land degradation and food insecurities. We need these kind of studies that address what is missing to turn the mitigation potential into reality. Next. In conclusion, science has no doubts. We can't achieve the Paris goals without land mitigation. However, some steps are needed to make this happen. First of all, more confidence in countries' estimates and comparability with the IPCC. More confidence in country estimates, especially in developing countries. So it is important to negotiate transparent rules under the Paris Agreement and to invest in capacity building so that developing countries can improve the quality of their estimates. Comparability with the IPCC means putting together different scientific communities and translate the result made by one so that these are comparable to the result by the greenhouse gas emitting communities. And second point, assuring credible accounting of forest mitigation, recognizing that not all the current forest sink is due to anthropogenic actions, but only a portion of that. Finally, identify strategies and trade-off for land mitigation to address multiple challenges. So feasibility is more important than the absolute potential. The land sector has the possibility and the responsibility to deliver. Next one. And only through concrete actions, I think the ugly duckling could be avoided, to be left behind, and could be eventually become a nice swan. Next. And hopefully our friends can fly with a balloon over the forest without getting lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. Now we'll have Jason Funk present. Jason, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. As usual, Giacomo was great. And what I'd like to do next is give a little bit of a sense of the history of how we got to where we are today in the complexities that Giacomo described, and hopefully tee up for Peter, where do we go from here? What comes next? To give you the complete history of accounting under the UNFCCC would be something we could cover over maybe the course of a semester, but I'm going to try to do it in just a few minutes. So I apologize if this is glossing over things that many people feel strongly about. I'll try to present this in the form of a timeline and just give you a sense of these different processes as they've unfolded over time. And I'll just do that in 2 slides, hopefully. So if it seems like they're complex at first, just relax, because I'll go through them relatively slowly. Next, please. So this first slide shows you the very beginning of this process and where we started from back in the early 90s. In 1992, we had the Framework Convention, and that's what kicked all of this off. So I'll begin to describe this as 4 different tiers of activity so we can follow along what's happening in sort of these different tracks. In the top tier in blue, I'll go through different stages of policy agreements and how those set the stage for what followed in the other tracks usually. The second tier down is relevant to policies that are in force and we're doing the accounting process, and countries are executing and implementing those activities. All of those activities, at least for the Kyoto Protocol, the first major agreement, they refer back to 1990 as the reference point for measuring initial emissions, and then we've been under efforts to reduce emissions since then. So that 1990 reference point was important. The third tier down, which doesn't start to appear until the right-hand part of this slide, will refer to activities in developing countries in the land sector, which fall under the things called REDD+. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means when we get to that point. And then the bottom tier here in purple balloons, we'll be talking about what's happening in the IPCC, primarily around the development of guidance for how to do emissions reporting and accounting as we go along. So as I mentioned already, this began in 1992 with the Framework Convention, under which all countries agreed to document and report what their emissions were from various activities within their economy as a way to begin to document also the reductions that would take place as a result of their efforts to address climate change. That initial agreement applied to almost all countries who were signatories to the convention, and that did not place too many obligations under countries. The convention sort of says we are all going to make efforts in this regard, but didn't specify how or how those would be accounted for. That didn't come until 1997 under the Kyoto Protocol. So that was the next stage in the policy development. Leading up to that point, countries needed to have some guidance about how they should do that reporting of their emissions. And that was coming from the IPCC. There's actually a few different types of guidance that came out in the 90s, and they sort of culminated in an agreement that the 1996 guidelines were accepted by all countries as the basis for doing their reporting in the future and as a way of documenting their emissions and reductions under the Kyoto Protocol. So that was the first time we had IPCC guidance setting up the accounting framework that countries would use in the implementation of the policy, namely the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was an agreement that only applied or only had obligations for reductions from developed countries. And those didn't come into effect until the 2000s. In 2008, that's when the KP entered into force. I'm sorry, it's 2005. So there was a wide gap between the actual signing of the Kyoto Protocol and its implementation. During that gap, folks realized, well, we've taken on these commitments. We need some additional rules about how we're going to count things. And the land sector, in particular, LULUCF, as Giacomo mentioned, was a key sticking point in that regard. It was fairly easy to understand how we could document reductions in fossil fuel emissions and other sectors. But because of this dual nature of the anthropogenic and natural processes that control GHG fluxes in the land sector, there was a challenge there in terms of how we were going to do that and what countries should do. That challenge was one of the things that contributed to a breakdown in the negotiations in The Hague in 2000. And this was a real crisis point for the UNFCCC negotiations. It was the following year then that we were able to resolve this issue in the negotiations and come up with new accounting rules for LULUCF that would apply to all countries under the Kyoto Protocol. And those were called the Marrakesh Accords. And those established the basis really for the rest of the Kyoto Protocol in terms of accounting for the land sector. After that, then the IPCC took up some new work in response to those accords to give further guidance to countries. And in 2003 issued new guidance, good practice guidance for LULUCF, which clarified and helped to give greater specificity to what was agreed in Marrakesh. Now, for a few years, things were ticking along, getting prepared for the implementation of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And in the meantime, among developing countries and all countries really, there began to be a discussion about how would we address avoided emissions or emissions reductions from deforestation in developing countries, which became a prominent issue that people understood was creating a lot of emissions and that were outside the scope of the Kyoto Protocol. So around 2005, we began to see this issue bubbling up of avoided deforestation and how that might be incentivized under the UNFCCC, and that eventually led to the mechanism we now call REDD+. Finally, just before I change, well, we've got a couple more things on this slide, but the IPCC came back again in 2006 and developed comprehensive guidance for all sectors. The 2006 guidelines under the IPCC then really became a point of sort of a high watermark for IPCC guidance. It reframed what was happening in the land sector and the way it was treated so that we now no longer just had LULUCF, but we had agriculture included along with forestry and other land uses. And that began a practice that went under the title of AFLU, the acronym for those activities, agriculture, forest, and other land use. So after 2006, there was a relatively long period where that guidance stood as the way countries would implement their work. this was also the point at which we introduced this idea of land-based accounting. Prior to that, we had focused on things that countries were implementing themselves under policies that affected specific activities in land management. And that activity-based accounting was what was utilized under the Kyoto Protocol for developed countries. They said, well, we're going to try to change this particular management practice, and we want to be able to document and account for that change that's a result of our policy. There was a realization then that that was missing a lot of emissions that were happening not the result of policies directly. And so there was a new framework that was established that was referred to as land-based accounting, which essentially means countries could do wall-to-wall accounting of the entire geographic area of their country and track all emissions and removals within that area rather than just tracking the results of specific policy interventions. So that was sort of a change in the paradigm. Both of those types of paradigms still exist and countries can use them, but we've got both of those things out there now, and there's some debate about which one is preferred. So I think we can jump to the next slide now. So we began the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, and very quickly folks realized, well, we're going to need to make some changes to this for the second commitment period. And they began a discussion and some negotiations around what those changes would look like. We also had efforts underway to develop a new comprehensive agreement among all countries that would affect all sectors. And that was teed up in the negotiations to occur in Copenhagen. But unfortunately, those negotiations did not succeed. And that resulted in another sort of crisis moment within the UNFCCC about what we were going to do next. Because partly in response to that crisis, those countries who had been working on this issue of avoided deforestation took this as a moment to step into this vacuum and say, hey, we can really make progress on this. We've been developing this issue over time, and we think it's ready for the next step. And so the year after the Copenhagen failure, we had Cancun, which was a major step forward in REDD+. There was a set of safeguards agreed in Cancun and some other provisions that really set the stage then for a further agreement on REDD+, how it could work and how it could be implemented. That brought us up to 2011, where debate about the land sector again came to a little bit of a decision point. Parties were beginning to think about how to implement the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And in Durban, a series of revisions were put in place, allowing some more flexibility in terms of the things that Giacomo mentioned with using projected reference levels. It also accommodated some emissions from natural disturbances, allowed parties to deal with that in a different way. And importantly, put some new obligations on developed countries to account for things that previously had been just voluntary. So that set the stage for 2013, the second commitment period coming into force. Also in 2013, in terms of REDD+, we agreed to the Warsaw Framework, which really built on Cancun and then cemented a complete package of REDD+ policy mechanisms, let's call them, that dealt comprehensively with this issue and allowed developing countries to move forward with their implementation plans. And after Warsaw, many developing countries said, okay, we're ready to just try to implement this for a few years and see how it goes. We don't want to make any more major policy changes on REDD+ for a while. 2013 was also a big year for IPCC guidance. It was the first time since 2006 that we'd had an update with some new things in play. So following up the agreements in Durban in 2011, the IPCC went away and did some work. And in fact, the other two gentlemen on this call, I think, were involved in this to develop a supplemental guidance for KP accounting for the second commitment period. And then also added this new guidance about the way wetlands could be documented and accounted for. Now, as Giacomo mentioned earlier, this brings us up to 2015, when there was a major new game-changing policy agreement at the international level, the Paris Agreement. And that did sort of change the framing of all this. The land sector now, because the Paris Agreement applied to all countries, not just developed countries, the it brought together in a new way all the work that had happened previously on this LULUCF track for developed countries and the REDD+ track for developing countries. Now they were all under one framework, without invalidating any of that previous work, but just saying these two things are now going to proceed, and we're going to try to bring them together under a common sort of comprehensive framework for the Paris Agreement. That was enshrined in Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, which calls out the role of the land sector, and Article 5.2 in particular brings forward the Warsaw Framework and says this is now legitimate as a part of the Paris Agreement. We're going to recognize its legitimacy going forward. That brings us almost up to the present day. This year, the IPCC released refinement to the previous guidance in 2006. And they did not see the need for a comprehensive overhaul, but in fact, just an update of that 2006 guidance. So it doesn't change the overall framework, it doesn't change sort of the paradigm that was established in 2006, continues to move that forward, and now establishes that as the basis for both reporting and then to be used for accounting under the Paris Agreement going forward. So we're looking forward to that coming into force next year. And we'll begin to see these activities play out, trying to resolve some of those challenges that have been experienced over the course of this history, but also turn the page and look forward to new activities and new seizing some of that potential that Giacomo referred to that has been clearly documented by recent science to try to activate the emissions reduction potential of the land sector. Okay, so I think that covers it. Brings us up to today, and I want to thank WRI and all of you for listening, and we'll look forward to some questions during the Q&A segment. Thanks.
Peter, you're up next. We're not hearing you at the moment.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we got you now.
I will be close to my computer. So I will be talking about the land sector accounting and reporting under the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So first, just to clarify that the land sector as such is not mentioned in the Paris Agreement or any of the other decisions. So I will be talking, just like also explained by both Giacomo and Jason, that we talk about agriculture and we talk about land use change and forestry. This is also how countries will be reporting the greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Agreement. And since agriculture basically always have been treated like any other sector, then I will also focus on LULUCF, just like the two previous presentations. Next, please. So for the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, National Determined Contribution, are the foundation. This is basically how we should achieve the long-term temperature goal set out in Article 2. If we look at the NDCs, most countries have submitted an NDC. More than 75% of them refers to land use. Some NDCs have LULUCF components implicitly included as part of an economy-wide emission reduction target, and some have a sector target. This sector target could be like X hectare of forest or X forest cover percentage by 2030, or increase in forest carbon stock. Some mention implementation of REDD+, etc. NDCs are diverse in nature, but there is also a call in the Paris Agreement that over time, all countries are encouraged to move towards economy-wide emission reduction targets. With such a diversity in NDCs, then it becomes critical for assessing progress, including also to build trust and confidence that we have a good transparency. So this is what I will be talking about. Next, please. Under the Paris Agreement, under the National Determined Contribution, sorry, I was just skipping a slide from my head. We have some principles. Parties are requested to account for the NDCs in a way that promote environmental integrity, transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency, and ensures the avoidance of double counting. But accounting is essentially national determined. I mean, when countries submit the NDC, they also submit how they will do their accounting. So that means parties can use different definitions, different accounting approaches, and methodologies for determining the contribution of LULUCF to the NDCs. Also, in the Paris Agreement, it was decided that parties in 2020 will either update or renew their NDC. You have to remember that the NDCs we have now were submitted, most of them as INDCs before the Paris Agreement, so that's all back in 2015. So now it's time to submit new ones. And now we also have some additional guidance that could be used. So next slide, please. In the Paris Agreement, the parties also decided on this enhanced transparency framework. So this was basically decided to build mutual trust and confidence, promote effective implementation, and enhance transparency for action and support. In this presentation, I'm not talking really about the support, but there's of course a lot related to finance, capacity building, etc. But I will focus on mitigation, and so this is more the action part, you could say. And then in Katowice, the COP we had last year, parties agreed on the modalities, procedures, and guidelines, the MPGs, for the transparency framework for this. Here also we have some overarching principles that highlights the importance of improvement over time. It includes some flexibility provisions for parties that need in light of the capacities, and there's a few more principles, but again, in the interest of time, I have focused on a few only. Parties also agreed on the content of what the new reporting, the biannual transparency report, which will contain, among other things, a national inventory report with a greenhouse gas inventory and information necessary to track progress. There's a few more things, but these are the things I will talk about here. Next slide. For the national inventory report, parties agreed to use as the 2006 IPCC guidelines and the global warming potential values from the IPCC fifth assessment report. Until now, some countries have been using the 2006 guidelines, and other countries have been using the 1996 guidelines. So here now they will have to use the same. Also, there was agreement to report by sector, and here we have agriculture and LULUCF as two separate sectors that will be reported on. Then there was specific guidance for two things specifically to LULUCF. If a party decides to use provisions to address emissions and removals from natural disturbances on managed land, then they have to provide how they're doing this, how it's consistent with IPCC guidance, etc., and whether it's included in the national totals. The same for harvested wood products, that if they, I mean, there's different ways you can report on your harvested wood products, but basically if you use a different approach from the production approach, then you also has to provide information so it fits to the production approach. So this is to allow basically to add up things up, so you're basically not sure you're not counting the same thing in two different countries. So next slide, please. But then for the NDC, so this is countries would also have to describe the NDC. This include again, and I have only had to select a few things only. Of course, things like coverage, scope, categories, activities, pools and gases. This is something that could be quite relevant for LULUCF, because maybe not all countries would be able to report on all pools and all gases from the beginning, for example. Countries shall also identify indicators they have selected to track progress. So this is relevant also because if you have different NDCs with different targets, then of course you also need some different indicators. It's not only greenhouse gases. And then there's a call for countries to also to include as all categories over time. And once a sink or a source has been included, then it should be continued to be included. This was a similar principle we actually had under the Kyoto Protocol. Next, please. For LULUCF, there was a special provision here also in the NDC, and here besides, I mean, it mentioned, of course, this is if it's applicable, because not all countries will necessarily have provisions to address natural disturbances, but if you do, then countries have to inform about the process they're using. If they are addressing also the emissions and removals from hazardous wood products, they have to mention how or state how they are doing it. And then we have an additional one, the effect of H-class structure in forest. So this is, some countries would have, you could say, an older forest. Maybe it's not growing so fast anymore. So other countries will have a younger forest. And if you use a projected reference level, as mentioned by Giacomo, then this could be reflected in your reference level, in your projected reference level. So this is basically to provide transparency about what you're doing. Next, please. Regarding ongoing work, so now we have COP25 coming up, and here one thing is to make the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement operational. Then we have next year, COP26, develop common reporting tables for the electronic reporting, I mean for the greenhouse gas inventories, etc. And then develop outlines of the biannual transparency report, national inventory document, and technical expert review report. So all the different documents and templates necessary for doing all this reporting. Next, please. So I think we can conclude that for the biannual transparency report by all parties, common reporting tables, use of the same guidelines, this will, and the same global warming potential, this will greatly improve transparency and comparability between parties and facilitate aggregation of estimates. The diversity of NDCs will be a challenge for the technical expert review teams, because you could have, of course, many different approaches they will have to understand, and many different assumptions they'll have to understand. And it could also mean that the aggregation of results, including for the global stocktake, could be challenging. So, and then also, as mentioned by Jason, that some countries have maybe been using activity-based accounting, and in fact, RED Plus is in principle an activity-based approach, because you have these different activities mentioned in the Cancun Agreement. But in some cases, we have seen countries that align it with the IPCC land use categories. And there could potentially be some benefits if countries decide to follow to use the accounting approach and follow what they do in also for reporting, where, I mean, for the greenhouse gas inventory, where they use a land-based approach, because that basically means they don't need to have two systems running at the same time. So that becomes a little bit, I think, on the Kyoto Protocol, countries were struggling because they basically had two different systems at the same time to maintain. And I think this is the last slide. So I think I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Just going through the questions now, trying to figure out where to start. Giacomo, there was a question in reference to your presentation about, you had mentioned the difficulty of reconciling IPCC and UNFCCC terms, and there was a suggestion from an attendee that you could remove the distinction between managed and unmanaged lands. At this stage, all land should be considered managed, and parties should be responsible for all lands within their
territories,
not just managed. Does that, sorry, I don't know if you could pick up there.
Okay, thanks. This is, it could be discussed, but it's, I would say, difficult to implement in the short term, in the sense that the greenhouse gas inventories are built on the IPCC guidelines. The IPCC guidelines in the last 20 years consistently used this concept of managed land as a proxy for anthropogenic fluxes. Proxy means that it's not something perfect. Essentially, when IPCC was asked formally to help countries to disentangle the natural from the anthropogenic component in the fluxes in land, the IPCC said, sorry, it is not possible to develop widely applicable methods usable by all countries to disentangle these two elements, the natural and the human ones. This can be done by models, but not by all countries with simple methods. And therefore, the APC suggested countries to define themselves what land are managed, including lands that fulfill social, economic functions, so in a very broad way, and to be responsible to report, to be responsible for all these emissions over time. In practice, most of the land in the developed countries like US, but also Europe, the vast majority is managed. This includes also parks, because if there is a land which is a park, a decision has been taken on this land. The unmanaged area are important in Russia, in Canada, in Brazil, and in some other developing countries, of course. But I would say 3/4 of the global forests are considered managed by countries. So they take somehow a responsibility over that. Changing the concept of managed land as a proxy for what is anthropogenic is a bit difficult, because countries say, well, this is what APC told us for 20 years, and we don't want to be responsible for, I don't know, extreme natural induced fires that occurred in a very remote area in Siberia or north of Canada. We are not responsible for that. So it's difficult to change, but the vast majority of land is anyway managed.
Great. We have another question about a set of questions just to dig a little bit more into accounting land use, different accounting methods. Gordon, one of our participants, had asked about the difference between additional info on the debits and credits that can be produced in accounting land use. And that was answered in the chat box, so I encourage everyone to look at that. But Gordon had a follow-up question about how is the forest reference level calculated? Current forest health, wilderness, industrial land, how is it defined and calculated? He also notes that huge amounts of money are on the table for our land managers, depending on the difference, the baseline chosen. So could you, Jason,
Yes.
can you address that one, or Giacomo?
The other two
No,
guys.
well,
Yeah.
Jason, go ahead.
Okay. Or Peter. Peter, why don't you address this one, if possible? Okay, Giacomo, go ahead.
Okay, I go. So essentially, no, the question is correct in the sense that if the forest reference level is a projections, it means the credibility of this projection depends on what you put into that. The risk is to transform a forest reference level into a baseline so low that any success is guaranteed. So to avoid that, I think that the concept, the principle developed under Kyoto, under the second commitment of Kyoto Protocol, had some problems in the sense that some policy assumption could be included in the projections. For example, a long discussion, a very controversial and politically heated discussion occurred in Europe in the last 3 years on the principle that should guide the setting of reference level. At the end, we came up with a new science-based principle which stated the reference level should be based on the continuation of forest management practice documented in the past. So no assumptions. So you just simulate the continuation of past management. Then when you change management, you will receive a benefit or credit or a debit, let's call it that. And this makes the forest sector conceptually comparable to other sectors. So if you change your previous behavior in any direction, the impact of this change is reflected in the accounts.
Okay, just following up on that previous question, Tomas kind of talks about specifically the situation in South America, Brazil and Argentina with corporate interest, really driving deforestation, the use of glyphosate, noting that the COP, that the Paris Agreement sets up a voluntary kind of system for driving land-based mitigation, and that it's insufficient to stop, this privatization, and is asking if there's anything being discussed at COP25 to address that. Anyone have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I can try to answer that. So there is a call now for, NDCs to update and renew, and I think there's always a call to be more ambitious than what we have seen so far. Basically, the result when you add up the accumulated effect of all NDCs submitted so far, this is far from bringing us sort of in safety below this 2 degrees target, and even worse in compared to the 1.5 degree. So it is constantly being discussed, definitely. But again, of course, it's still national sovereignty. So this is like countries are trying to pressure each other to move ahead and be more ambitious.
Okay, follow-up question to you, Peter. Are there processes for scientists to get more involved in COP25 and COP26, I guess in the UNFCCC process on this particular sector?
Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question.
Well, it was, the question was, you mentioned working at COP25 and COP26, and she was, this questioner is asking if there are processes that scientists can participate in with respect to developing the rules for land sector accounting.
I mean, there's always lots of people at the COP, including scientists, that are not, you can say, necessarily part of a country's delegations in the negotiations. Of course, they're trying to present their results from their research and thereby influence the decisions, so it will be sound, scientifically sound decisions. But of course, to attend a COP, then you need to be accredited to the COP, and then you have to be in some group that, there's groups of scientists, and there's many different groups that you could sort of join and be part of, but you cannot go as an individual and say, I would like to come to the COP and tell you what you should.
Okay. And following up again, Peter, have there been any guidelines proposed to avoid double counting of NDC reporting with carbon projects under the UNFCCC or voluntary markets?
There has been a lot of, they talk about this Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, which is about basically trading on emission reductions and removal units. And here there's an overall principle, just like the principle I think I mentioned in the presentation, to avoid double counting. So this is on the radar. I think for now, most of the discussion is about avoiding double counting, like 2 countries are accounting the same unit. The link to the voluntary carbon markets, I think there's talks about, like, for example, COSIA, and there are some others, but I'm not following that discussion so closely, so I could not be 100% sure here.
Okay,
this is Jason. I just thought I would jump back in on this question about scientists participating in the COPs. There are many institutions that are accredited, lots of universities and research institutes that already have accreditation. And if you're a member of one of those institutions, it's worth checking and asking to see if there are, in fact, ways that you can get involved. Establishing new accreditation for an organization or something like myself, where I've just started a new initiative, that takes quite a bit of time. So I think it's already past the time when I could be accredited for COP26 because the process takes a while. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to seek out ways to do that through existing accredited organizations. The time period for getting the badges that allow you to participate in the COP, I think that's already passed for this upcoming COP25. It may be that those institutions have some available, particularly for researchers. And then there are channels by which folks can participate primarily through either environmental NGOs or for research institute NGOs, which go by the acronyms NGOs and RINGOs. And that provides a channel and sort of a means by which folks can get engaged in the negotiations themselves. So it's always worth checking out.
Great. And another participant offers advice as well. Thank you to that, Mr. Galinsky. He says the best way to participate in COP discussions is to publish scientific papers. Okay. Another question related to support that was referenced with Peter Iverson's presentation. You know, where do countries or get support? That was talked about, and then also a question about carbon offsetting. Is it okay to be done for paying for the cost of releasing carbon from, is it okay to mitigate, let's say, aviation emissions with carbon offsetting in the forest sector? Giacomo, could you possibly address that? That's a big question, I know, big area that doesn't really, not really part of the accounting discussion, but how would you respond to that?
Could you repeat, please?
Is it okay to use carbon offsetting to pay for, to account for in the equation of trying to reduce carbon emissions?
You mean the personal carbon offsetting?
Yeah.
Well, this is very, let's say, somehow personal question as well. I think that it should be seen not as a long-term solution, but in the short term may certainly help.
And what about Peter's other support? I guess either in developing accounting systems for countries or for paying for carbon sink projects in forestry. I'm not sure exactly what she was referencing to, but the question was, where can we get the information about support? You didn't talk about, Peter.
Yeah, I think the best will probably be to go to the to our website, the UNFCCC's website, and look it up there. I know we have programs to help countries to build up capacity to improve their reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. I know also, of course, there's, if you're talking about activities on the land, for example, then of course there's the Green Climate Fund, there's the Jeff, there's these different environmental funds under the convention that are supporting this kind of action. But then you, again, this, yeah, then you should go to their website to find more information.
Okay. Question to Jason. Why did the IPCC only call for refinement of the 2006 guidelines? Peter Riggs is suggesting that we need a more thoroughgoing review of the bioenergy accounting, but all we got was refinement. What's next? What's the next chance for a proper review of the guidelines?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, for that question. And I think I share your sentiment that, in particular around bioenergy, this is an issue that at times has been, the 2006 guidelines on this issue has been misinterpreted at times. To generally, the interpretation has been that it says, oh, bioenergy, this is all carbon neutral, no problems here. In fact, that's not what that guidance says, but because of the way it was written, I think it left enough flexibility open that people have interpreted it in different ways. Not always accurately, in my view. So I had the privilege of being part of a scoping meeting for the IPCC in 2016 that was setting up the framework for what would be covered in the refinement. And that this issue came up very clearly, and folks realized that there was this ongoing sort of misinterpretation of what had been done in the past. And just remember that, you know, prior to 2006, there wasn't a whole lot of wood and biomass being burned for energy. It was primarily something that was referring to, you know, people burning firewood and wood burning stoves and things like that for heat. So it wasn't a big issue. Nobody had really been thinking about this as an industrial process that was going to be producing electricity at massive scales. So I think that did enter into the discussion about the refinement as a priority. I was part of a few meetings there which were cross-cutting between energy sector folks and land sector folks, trying to talk about how to provide greater clarity about this issue. And then in the refinement itself, there's quite an extensive elaboration about how countries can avoid accounting problems, how they can report more transparently, and where some of those problematic issues can arise if they using existing guidance. It primarily occurs when there's wood products crossing boundaries, so crossing borders, imports and exports. So I think there's been a major improvement, though I agree that there will become a point down the road, if this issue becomes a larger thing, where we'll need to do a review of that, because I think there still is an opportunity for these emissions to not be accounted for by any country, and that would be a problem.
Okay, we've run out of time. We've got more questions. If it's okay, just spend 5 more minutes answering the last 3 questions. The first one is about REDD+. REDD+ has more rules such as safeguards and baseline rules. If you use a land-based approach, then there is no biodiversity or social reporting. How do you determine anthropogenic emissions, I guess it is, on managed lands? That's a lot to comment on there. Could take the first or the last part of it, but could one of our panelists talk a little bit more about REDD+?
Maybe I would like to do that. So, I mean, when I mentioned that REDD+ is activity-based, yes, it is, but some countries then decided to define it sort of in the framework on the land-based, so they could say deforestation is basically forest land that are being transferred to other land, and then you can have enhancement of forest carbon stock could be other lands that become forest land. So you could actually, and that will not change on how you have to report on the safeguards and the other things, but it will just basically just clarify your definitions will follow the way that countries are reporting under the convention. So this is possible, I would say, without changing these other things.
Peter, any thoughts on that question, or Jason? No. Okay, next question. In the context of reporting emissions, what is the significance of splitting apart agriculture from LULUCF as contained in the Paris Agreement? Jason, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is an area that we've kind of gone back and forth over the course of the history. Should agriculture be included with this or separated from it? I think that the approach that the IPCC has taken is a really technical one, and they've chosen to put this in terms of activities that are not occurring on the basis of area. Agricultural activities like livestock management, for example, those are driven primarily by the number of cattle you have, let's say, and not by the acreage of land that's in pasture land, for example. And so this is just purely a technical distinction between the types of activities. When we're talking about land management itself, which could, in this case, include grazing lands, that means the activities that apply directly to the management of the land. Agricultural emissions then are sort of sectioned off to say, well, these are activities that are not around the management of land, but the production or activities that are counted differently, the more in line with the way we count other sectors on the basis of the intensity of the activity, not its spatial coverage. And then it also has to do with the way we've just divvied up the greenhouse gases. Agriculture primarily deals with non-CO2 greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, and then where land management has to do with CO2 emission fluxes, then we tend to put those things into the LULUCF basket. But it's not always a sharp line, so it's just a matter of decisions that have been made in the past that we've have been intended to divvy these things up in a way that's consistent and mutually exclusive. And I won't say that it's always been the best way. Giacomo and Peter might have other thoughts on that as well.
Yes, I may complement what Jason correctly said. I think that a key distinction between agriculture and LULUCF, which is policy relevant, is that essentially the fluxes in agriculture are all emissions, first of all, and are all anthropogenic, mainly non-CO2 emissions and fully anthropogenic. So the fluxes in the agricultural sector are comparable to all the fluxes in the energy sector or the transport sectors, while everything that is in LULUCF has to do directly or indirectly with the natural carbon cycle. And therefore, it's very difficult to disentangle the natural component from the anthropogenic ones. So essentially, this distinction leaves in the LULUCF sector all the complexity of disentangling the natural and anthropogenic complex. And that's why LULUCF sector is so complex, difficult to understand and explain, and why the policy thought a lot and discussed a lot about accounting rules. Essentially, the accounting rules, in a nutshell, are aimed to make this distinction between what is natural and what is the additional anthropogenic action. They do it in an imperfect way, but it's essentially the aim of the accounting rule.
Okay, last question. I think this strays into Article 6. So I'm thinking, Peter, you could answer this one. But what if a project landowner or company wants to generate and trade credits for their projects, even if the host, can they do that even if the host country has no greenhouse gas trading scheme, as is the case in many EU countries?
So, I mean, basically for the voluntary carbon market is not regulated, of course, by the Paris Agreement. So whatever rules they have and what they will allow, this is up. There's a number of different schemes, I guess. And yeah, this could happen. But this, of course, will not be regulated by the Paris Agreement. What will come out of the Paris Agreement and the Article 6 negotiations is too early to say, because parties are still negotiating this. So I couldn't really be able to say how it will work in that context. But for sure, what is happening in the voluntary carbon market outside the Paris Agreement is, in a way, a totally separate issue.
Okay, great. So, well, let me say we've got one last question, which is from Gordon Merrick, talking about all the co-benefits of, I guess, forestry mitigation, and could there be possibility of a system thinking analysis of these programs? Carbon is vitally important, but so is biodiversity, water purification, and access to green space. All of these things may reduce carbon, but also provide multitudes of environmental services that have never been fully accounted for economically. Do any of our panelists see kind of greenhouse gas accounting moving into that area of more systematically reporting and of benefits? Jason, have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point to make. And I think that at the country level, many countries are thinking in that sort of systems type approach of how to secure all of those different types of benefits. The challenge for those countries then is to articulate what are the climate aspects of that are going to be relevant to their commitments under the UNFCCC or their contributions under the Paris Agreement. And that's really where I think a lot of organizations are working to support countries in figuring those issues out. And then there's a range of different ways that countries can engage to try to capture all of those benefits together. Monetizing them under some sort of climate finance framework is still a challenge. And I think there's recognition of those issues among the finance community that, oh, we should really approach this in a more comprehensive way. But for the moment, what we have is a system that's oriented toward the climate aspects of those issues. And we need to think about how those connect with other types of agreements, for example, the Convention on Biodiversity, and whether or not those streams can be brought together in a way that offers a clear path to countries for approaching that in a systems way that secures all those benefits and gets adequate support for them. We're not there yet, but I think there's a lot of discussion about those points and efforts underway to try to build that sort of more solid integrated platform for countries.
Great, that's a good place to end. Thank you for sticking with us. Feel free to email me any further questions or future topics for webinars, and we look forward to seeing you next time. That ends the webinar. Thank you to our panelists for sticking with us, especially.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.